As computing power increased throughout the late 80s and early 90s, the potential use cases of home computers grew at a similar rate. The 1990s saw an explosion of multimedia software and hardware which took advantage of the new technology. At the heart of it was the CD-ROM, packing huge amounts of data into a single optical disc. Software titles such as Microsoft Encarta and Myst made full use of the storage that CD-ROMs offered. To power these, a fast processor was a must. It was an age of multimedia madness. Intel, by far the market leader in the PC space, knew that they would need to continue their advancements in order to power this new multimedia age. By late 1992, the company had spent 3 years developing the 486 successor, and didn't want anyone else to profit off it. Up until this point, second sourcing was an almost universal staple of the industry. Multiple manufacturers would produce variants of a company's microprocessor, such that supply was always ensured. However, as Intel entered near monopoly levels of market share, the chipmaker did not want other companies to profit off its new products, and cut all second sourcing agreements. In addition, it also didn't want other CPU manufacturers to use its branding for their advantage. Other companies, such as Cyrix and AMD, had created products which used the 386 and 486 tagline in their brand names. The result of this meant that Intel's new chip would have a new name: the Intel Pentium. The Pentium was launched in early 1993 and was an immediate hit. The chip was blazing fast and blew the doors off anything else on the market. Its dual pipeline design allowed the chip to process simple and complex instructions simultaneously, known as a superscalar architecture. The chip also benefited from a turbocharged floating point unit, which was up to 15 times faster than the one used in the 486. Byte magazine put it best when they ran a double-page spread saying Pentium changes the PC, indicating that the Pentium was so fast it would be bottlenecked by other system components. In fact, this was the Pentium's biggest problem. The other components, RAM, storage, display adapter, weren't ready to take advantage of the Pentium's true performance, and the need for the latest hardware meant the cost of Pentium machines was prohibitively expensive. This created heightened demand for 486 machines, and allowed Intel's competition to flourish. The AMD AM486 and Cyrix CX486 were two microprocessors that had been reverse engineered from Intel's part. These processors performed at roughly the same level as Intel's 486, but was cheaper. For example, a 40 MHz AM486 cost the same as a 33 MHz Intel 486. This competition continued, and although it would take several years, both AMD and Cyrix came up with Pentium competitors. The AMD K5 and Cyrix 6X86 were both released in 1996, delivering Pentium performance at a lower price. Things were looking good for the market, until one application changed everything. Quake was the hottest PC game of 1996, and was a visual marvel. Quake's levels guided players through a fully texture-mapped 3D world, rendered in real time. To power such a feat, a Pentium processor was a must. id Software had taken maximum advantage of Pentium-specific optimizations, and the game heavily relied on floating point calculations. Up until this time, almost all applications relied exclusively on integer maths, where the 686 and K5 could beat the Pentium. In Quake, however, they couldn't come close. Cyrix was hit particularly hard, as its floating point performance was extremely weak in comparison to Intel's. The chipmaker was soon relegated to producing low-cost products for entry-level machines, and the company merged with National Semiconductor in 1997, ending its x86 development. This issue didn't hurt AMD in anywhere near the same extent though. This was due to the chipmaker acquiring NextGen, another semiconductor company who had produced 486 class CPUs for PCs. NextGen had been working on the successor to their own Pentium competitor, the NX586, and this design would become the basis for AMD's new processor. The result was the AMD K6, which would release in 1997. Despite launching 4 years after the Pentium, the chip could match the very best on the market. To keep on top of the industry, Intel had intended the Pentium to be replaced with the Pentium Pro in 1995, thus extending their performance lead. The Pentium Pro used an advanced architecture called P6, which put heavy emphasis on improved 32-bit performance, but suffered in 16-bit applications. This was a problem, since Intel had overestimated the amount of 32-bit code that would be used in Windows 95 and its applications, resulting in the Pentium Pro delivering no real performance gain over the Pentium. This meant that by 1997, 4 years after the Pentium had launched, it was still the company's fastest chip. The bad news for Intel was that AMD's K6 was fast, faster than an equivalent Pentium, and cost less. The K6 architecture was vastly superior to the K5's, and the chip was a huge success. Feeling the heat, Intel released the Pentium 2 the same year, which used the same architecture as the Pentium Pro, but with a number of improvements and cost reductions. The Pentium 2 was fast, but it wasn't a leap forward that the Pentium had been. While the chip was faster in floating point applications, AMD's K6 and its successor, the K6-2, were faster in integer performance. This meant for gaming, Intel was ahead, but for everyone else, you could just save the money and get a K6. Intel's competition was not limited to the x86 space, however. Apple, who were the last remaining manufacturer of 68K computers in the early 90s, saw the rapid performance increases of Wintel PCs and knew that they had to look to a new architecture in order to keep up. Motorola, who had built the 68K, also knew that their architecture would not last the next 10 years. To combat Intel, Apple and Motorola teamed up with IBM to produce a brand new RISC-based microarchitecture called PowerPC. The RISC philosophy, standing for Reduced Instruction Set Computing, aimed to simplify the low-level micro-operations that made up computer programs. The RISC instruction set had far fewer instructions than the CISC instruction set found in x86 machines, meaning that in theory, architectural improvements would be easier to design and implement. Many in the 1990s believed that RISC instruction sets were the future, and that the complex nature of a CISC architecture would limit its potential. It was during this time that many RISC architectures were developed, including PowerPC, UltraSpark from Sun, and Intel's Itanium. Power was first introduced on the desktop in 1994 with Apple's Power Macintosh line, and provided a much-needed performance boost to Apple's family. The first PowerPC chip, the 601, was up to 3 times faster than the Motorola 68040 CPU that it replaced. The performance improvements continued, with the PowerPC 750 launching in 1997. The chip, branded by Apple as the G3, was the fastest CPU in the world, and solidified the idea that RISC was the architecture of the future. The chip was up to 30% faster than the Pentium 2 in some applications, and due to its low power usage, meant that Apple's laptops would easily outperform Intel equivalents. Intel was starting to feel pressure from competition on both the PC and Mac side, and by early 1999, AMD had overtaken them in sales. The response? The Pentium 3. Considered by many to be a rebrand, early Pentium 3s were nothing more than Pentium 2s, but with a new cache controller and Intel's new SSE instructions. SSE allowed the CPU to drive the floating point unit as a vector processor, allowing a program to do a calculation on 4 floating point numbers in the time it would take to do one. This technology had been introduced by AMD on the K62, called 3D Now, but it was not widely adopted, and Intel's adaptation would become the industry standard. The Pentium 3 was the fastest x86 CPU on release, but only briefly. AMD would release the Athlon in late 1999, a chip that was definitively faster than the Pentium 3. The Athlon was ahead in integer calculations, but even further ahead in floating point. Intel responded with a whole host of modifications to the Pentium 3 core, including introducing an onboard L2 cache. These second-generation Pentium 3 CPUs were known as Coppermine, and while they were not faster than the Athlon clock for clock, they had far better motherboard support and used less power. They should have been big sellers, but they weren't. Intel was in the process of transitioning from the 250 to 180 nanometer manufacturing node, and this transition was fraught with problems. A 1 GHz Coppermine Pentium 3 would just about outperform a first generation Athlon, but you just couldn't buy the Intel part. Stock was severely limited, and faced with no other choice, retailers and OEMs were forced to build Athlon PCs. To further boost performance, AMD refreshed the Athlon by moving the cache to be on die, like the Coppermine Pentium 3s, which allowed them to crank up the clock speeds all the way to 1.4 GHz. With continued lack of supply of Pentium 3s, AMD invested in another manufacturing plant in Germany to keep up with demand. The news got worse for Intel, because it was around this time that the PowerPC 7400, more commonly known as the G4, was released. The G4 was the first PowerPC chip to implement SSC-like features called UltraVec, and performance easily overtook x86 CPUs in PCs, even at low clock speeds. Intel released the Pentium 4 in late 2000, but it was clear that the product had been rushed to market, as it was power hungry, hot, and slow. Not only could the Pentium 4 not match the Athlons, it couldn't even match AMD's budget-friendly Duron CPUs. In early 2002, the product was updated to include more cache, support faster memory, and included higher clock speeds. Using Intel's new 130nm process, the chip could now clock fast enough to beat AMD's flagship, which had been renamed Athlon XP. However, with upcoming launches from PowerPC and AMD, it was clear that the performance crown would not be held for long.